Hey there, welcome to our deep dive on building better habits, those tiny changes that can lead to huge results. We're going to be digging into Atomic Habits by James Clear today. And I think this one's really going to click, for anyone who's constantly looking to learn and grow and become the best version of themselves.
Absolutely. And what's really cool is how Clear connects those tiny changes, he calls them atomic habits, to the bigger picture of who we become.
Yeah, it's like that saying, we are what we repeatedly do.
Exactly. But then Clear, he takes it a step further, right? He's like, these small actions, they're not just mindless things. They're actually like casting votes for the type of person we want to be.
This reminds me of?
Yeah.
Clear's own story, right? Like, he wasn't always this peak performer, super successful. Back in high school, he had this awful injury, could have been sidelined for good.
Oh yeah, I remember that. He had to rebuild himself from scratch, like one tiny improvement at a time,
And those small wins, those little victories, they took him all the way to becoming an all-American athlete. Proof that this stuff actually works, even when life throws you a curveball.
It's truly inspiring, right? Like, we're not defined by our setbacks, but how we choose to respond to those setbacks. That's where these atomic habits come into play.
It's not about some massive overnight transformations, it's about playing the long game, focusing on those small, sustainable changes that add up big time over time, kind of like consistently putting money into a savings account.
Absolutely. You might not become a millionaire overnight, but keep at it. The power of compounding, it'll kick in, I promise you.
Okay, so let's say you want to write more consistently. You mentioned that you struggle to find the time, right? How could someone use this idea of atomic habits to finally make that happen?
That's where Clear's 4 laws of behavior change come in. They make habits obvious, attractive, easy, and satisfying. Let's just start with making it obvious. What's your environment like? Is it set up in a way that helps you write more, or is it working against you?
So instead of relying purely on willpower, it's about setting up your surroundings to encourage that desired action, making it almost inevitable.
100%. Imagine this. Your laptop, a fresh notebook, sitting right there on your desk, first things you see every morning. Bam! Cue's obvious. You're practically invited to write.
I love that you're removing those mental barriers before they even have a chance to pop up. Out of sight, out of mind, right?
Exactly. Now, let's make writing more enticing. Think about something you genuinely enjoy doing. Could you combine that with your writing time? Maybe brew a special cup of coffee or put on your favorite playlist.
Oh, that's a good idea.
Yeah.
It's almost like giving yourself a little reward in advance. So the act of writing itself becomes something you look forward to. Reminds me of habit stacking from the book.
Oh, yeah. You're good. That's exactly it. Habit stacking is all about linking a new habit to an existing one. So instead of saying, okay, I'm going to write for a whole hour today, you could try, after I make my morning coffee, I'm going to write for like 15 minutes.
See, that feels so much more doable. Attaching it to something you already do, you're more likely to actually follow through. It's like you're building this routine, not all at once, but brick by brick, one small action at a time.
And that, my friend, brings us to law number 3, making it easy. But I get it, even 15 minutes, some days that can feel like a lifetime. Remember the 2-minute rule.
The 2-minute rule. Oh, right. Breaking down a task into a 2-minute version. So instead of write for 15 minutes, you might say, I'm just going to open my laptop and write one single sentence.
Nailed it. See, now you're not committing to this epic writing session. You're just dipping your toes in the water.
And that feels way less scary. It's like tricking your brain into just getting started. And honestly, once you get going, who knows what might happen? Right? You might surprise yourself with how much you get done.
It's amazing how powerful a little shift in perspective can be, right? But what about those days when even getting started feels impossible, when even that first sentence feels like climbing a mountain?
Oh, tell me about it. We all have those days where we just hit a wall and mustering up that motivation feels like, a lot of work.
Exactly, and that's where the 4th law comes in, making it satisfying. How can you reward yourself after a writing session in a way that makes you actually want to come back for more? Maybe it's a delicious snack you've been eyeing. Or maybe it's giving yourself permission to just relax and recharge guilt-free.
So it's about creating this positive feedback loop.
Yeah.
You do the thing, you get a little reward, and then boom, your brain starts associating writing with something positive, making you want to do it again.
Bingo. You got it. And the best part is, the reward doesn't have to be anything extravagant. Even something as simple as checking off a box on a habit tracker can give you that little dopamine boost, to keep that motivation train chugging along.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
But, besides the practical stuff, I'm curious about the mental side of all this. Clear talks about how our habits shape our identity, and our identity shapes our habits. It sounds kind of deep, but how does that actually play out in the real world?
Well, think of it this way. Every time we do something, it's like we're casting a vote for the kind of person we believe we are. So if you consistently show up for your writing, even if it's just for a few minutes every day, you're basically telling yourself, hey, I'm a writer.
So it's not just about changing what we do, it's about changing the story we're telling ourselves about who we are deep down.
Exactly. And the thing is, those stories, they have a sneaky way of becoming self-fulfilling prophecies. If you're walking around thinking, I'm not a writer, or I'm not good at this, well, you're probably not going to put in the effort to improve, right?
It's like Henry Ford said, whether you think you can or you think you can't, you're right.
100%. Our beliefs are incredibly powerful. They influence our actions more than we realize. So if you genuinely want to make a change that lasts, you got to start with those beliefs, those little voices in your head.
Easier said than done sometimes. So how do we actually do that?
Yeah.
How do we quiet those doubts that tell us we're not good enough or talented enough or disciplined enough?
It takes effort, for sure, but it's definitely doable. One thing Clear talks about is the power of reframing those negative thoughts. So let's say that voice pops up and says, you're not a writer. Instead of letting it spiral, you can try saying, hey, I'm someone who's learning to write. Subtle difference, right? But that shift in language, that can work wonders on how you see yourself.
It's about focusing on the process, right? The journey of becoming, rather than getting hung up on some fixed definition of who we are.
Right. It's like giving yourself permission to be a work in progress.
Yeah.
Because let's be real, we're all constantly evolving.
Right.
And that includes you and your writing.
I love embracing the journey, the ups, the downs, the inevitable stumbles along the way. Speaking of stumbles, I think one of the biggest things people struggle with is staying motivated when the going gets tough. Like that initial excitement wears off, the novelty fades, and all of a sudden, it's just you and the daily grind. Clear talks about the importance of falling in love with boredom. Sounds kind of crazy, right?
It does sound a little counterintuitive, doesn't it? But it's about recognizing that the path to mastery, it's not always glamorous or exciting. It's often about finding joy in the repetition, the discipline, showing up day after day, even when you'd rather be doing anything but that.
I was listening to an interview with this really famous musician, and they were saying that the most successful musicians aren't always the ones with the most natural talent. It's the ones who are willing to practice every single day, even when they don't feel like it. It's about falling in love with the process, not just the outcome.
Spot on. And that's a perfect example of what we're talking about. It's about finding that love for the craft, the act of creation, not just being fixated on the end result, the applause or the accolades.
That makes a lot of sense. But in a practical way, how do we actually do that? How do we go from dreading those daily tasks to actually, finding some enjoyment in the process, especially when it comes to things that we might find tedious or challenging?
It's about celebrating those small wins, those little victories that might seem insignificant on their own, but they add up big time. Maybe it's writing that first sentence, finishing that first page, or getting some positive feedback from someone. Those little wins, they're like fuel for your motivation tank.
I love that. It's about reframing how we define success. Like progress over perfection, right? It's not about being perfect. It's about making those tiny steps forward.
Exactly. And when you celebrate those wins, no matter how small, it helps you stay committed, even when the going gets tough. It's like telling yourself, hey, I'm still in this, I'm making progress.
So, for someone listening who's feeling stuck, maybe they're struggling to find that motivation to keep going, what advice would you give them based on what Clear talks about in Atomic Habits?
I'd tell them to remember that often action comes before motivation. Sometimes the best way to get motivated is to just start, even if it's just for a few minutes.
Like just take that first step, right? Sometimes that's the hardest part. It's like that old saying, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step.
Truth. And that's where that 2-minute rule we were talking about comes in handy again. It's that gentle nudge to remind yourself that even the smallest action can get the ball rolling. Make that next step feel a little less daunting.
It's like, when you're pushing a swing, and it takes that initial effort to get it going, but once you've got that momentum, it's like it almost swings itself. And speaking of momentum, what really stuck with me from the book? The Goldilocks rule.
Oh, yeah, the Goldilocks rule.
Finding that sweet spot, right? Not too hard, not too easy.
Absolutely. I'm all about that.
How does that fit in with everything we've been talking about with habits?
So the Goldilocks rule, right? It's all about finding that sweet spot between like boredom and being completely overwhelmed. Because think about it.
Yeah.
If you're working on something too easy, you get bored, right? You check out.
Yeah.
But then if it's too hard, you just get frustrated, you want to give up. So it's about finding that zone where the task is challenging enough to keep you engaged.
Engaged.
But not so much that it makes you want to quit. And that's where that flow state comes in, you know?
Oh, flow state. I love when that happens.
Yes.
Where like you're so absorbed in what you're doing that time just seems to disappear.
You're in the zone.
You're in the zone, yeah.
And it's not just that it feels good, it's also like often when we produce our best work,
yeah.
You know?
You're at your most creative.
100%.
Yeah,
like
yeah.
Athletes talk about this too. They're in the zone. They're not even thinking. They're just performing.
So it's not just about like picking something that'll hold our attention. It's about finding that level of challenge that actually helps us grow and perform at our best.
Exactly. It's about pushing those boundaries, but not so much that you break, you know?
And, you know, it makes me think about Clear's own story, right? Overcoming that devastating injury to become an all-American athlete. It sounds like he kind of instinctively understood the Goldilocks rule. He didn't try to do too much too soon. It was all about those small, steady improvements over time.
It's like that saying, slow and steady wins the race.
Totally. He talks about how he'd rather be too slow for one day than injured for a week.
Yeah.
He was playing the long game, and he knew that he had to gradually up the challenge as he got stronger.
Exactly. Patience, my friend.
Patience, yeah. Which, honestly, that's a tough one, but so important. Trusting that all those small steps will eventually lead to big results.
It's not about instant gratification, it's about the long game.
The long game, exactly.
And you know what? This brings us back to that idea of identity, right? Because if we see ourselves as someone who's always learning and growing, those setbacks, those plateaus, they're not failures. They're just part of the journey, you know?
Totally. It's like we're all going to stumble. We're all going to have those days where we're like, I don't want to do this. But it's about getting back up, dusting ourselves off, and remembering why we started in the first place.
100%. It's about that growth mindset. You're not defined by your mistakes. You're defined by how you bounce back from them.
Okay, so before we wrap this up, I want to circle back to something you said earlier, how our actions are like votes for the kind of person we want to be. And it got me thinking, you know, we've been talking about habits, but if our habits really are the building blocks of our lives, is it possible to actually like design your life intentionally, one habit at a time?
That's a big question. I love it. On one hand, we definitely have some say in who we become, right? We can choose to start new habits. We can choose to ditch old ones. We can create an environment that supports those choices. So yeah, we're not just along for the ride, you know? We have agency.
Yeah, we're not just like passive bystanders.
Exactly. But I gotta be realistic, right? There's stuff outside our control too. Our genes, how we were raised, the circumstances we find ourselves in.
It's that nature versus nurture debate, right?
Yeah.
It's probably a little bit of both.
It's always a mix. And that's what makes it all so interesting. It's about working with what we've got, pushing those boundaries, and seeing what we can create, one tiny change at a time.
You know what? This has been an incredible deep dive into atomic habits, those tiny changes. They really do have the power to completely transform our lives. If you take away just one thing from this conversation, I hope it's this. You have more control than you think. You can shape your habits, and those habits, they shape your destiny.
I love that. You're the sculptor of your own life, my friend.
And if you haven't already, definitely check out Atomic Habits by James Clear. Trust me, it's full of even more practical tips and strategies for building those good habits and really unlocking your full potential. Until next time, keep those tiny changes rolling.